I want to welcome everyone to the hashtag Safer to Be Me symposium. Thank you all for being here. We welcome you to Reports Out's global symposium to discuss LGBTQI+ human rights and development needs. My name is Jonah and I'm Sustainable Development Officer, Goals Officer at Report Out. Welcome to our online satellite event, of which a recording can be found on our YouTube channel in the following weeks. Our symposium is in a partnership between Report Out and the University of Sunderland. It brings together global activists, practitioners, and academics to discuss the most pressing issues, global LGBTQI+ human rights issues, and LGBT+ progress towards fulfilling the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. We have a range of online Zoom events prepared for you. We hope this will get you ready for our symposium launch and our main event, which is taking place next week on the 22nd of June in Sunderland. As part of our planning for hashtag Safer to Be Me, we wanted to offer some satellite events as online talks so everyone can get involved in their own way and get excited for next week. There will also be opportunities for you to watch the talks on the main day of the symposium on Zoom as well, so you're not missing out. The link for the tickets on the 22nd of June can be found on our website and will be dropped in this chat box around this talk. We have a range of previous events on YouTube, on our channel. This includes discussions with panelists from nations such as Mongolia, Ghana, and the Cayman Islands. Or we have talks on wider regional areas such as South Asia and historical talks such as the Men in Pink Triangle under Nazi Germany. So please do check out the channel. Our donation link will also be dropped in the chat at different intervals. We're an entirely volunteer-led charity, and small charities like us could always do with your support. And your donation will go directly to the work that we do. Thank you. I'll make sure all these links are shared with you momentarily. But joining us this evening is our panelist, Sarah Connolly. Sarah is a lecturer at the University of Sunderland, working across criminology and sociology. Her primary interests focus on researching how marginalised groups interpret and navigate their identities. This includes identity politics and gender fluidity, sociology of diagnosis, the governance of bodies and police custody, and the reification of binary coding in medicine. Today, she'll be talking about trans and non-binary rights in the UK. Just to let everyone know, we will have time at the end for Q&A, so please put any questions you have for Sarah in the chat. Thank you very much, and over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you so much. And hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your time today. So my talk will be exploring the current human rights situation in the United Kingdom. And this will be regarding autonomy and agency for trans and non-binary communities. Now, the title of this talk is a little bit different, I'm aware, and it came from a sweep of articles that I started to see cropping up nearish the back end of last year. So what we'll be talking through today are a number of themes, but in a nutshell, I'm very, very interested in how young people in particular are navigating human rights situations, particularly in the UK. So we'll start with some context, we will map out the area, and then we'll jump into that so what factor of what we're talking about today. So in this talk, I'll say now that I will not be able to encapsulate every and all aspects of the current human rights situation in the UK. And that's not what I'm intending to do. Instead, I'm using this space to focus on a particular lens on young people in relation to support. Now, there will be some harrowing statistics used within this presentation, and the point of this is, again, just to shine a light of what has been going on within the United Kingdom. So just to get us started, so again, my name is Sarah Connolly, and I am a lecturer in the social sciences, and I teach across a range of things from intersectionality to lived experience. And again, I'm interested in how we navigate marginalised voices and normalised spaces. A few years ago, I used to work as a past support worker. So as a support worker, I worked with young individuals between the ages of 11 to 25 in relation to gender fluidity. And in these conversations, a few things started to crop up to me. And they were more so about how do people know about their human rights? So what can we do with our bodies? What can't we do with our bodies? When can we do these things? So from my research, what I'm really interested in is seeing how people understand their human rights and also what we can do about this moving forward. Now, whenever we talk about gender, identity, equality, anything like that, we need to introduce ourselves. So I'm a white cis woman. My pronouns are she and her. And again, my background is like within lecturing, support work, and I manage a small organisation in the criminal justice system. The themes of today, and again, we've got quite a lot to jam pack into these 35 minutes, but essentially we'll be toying with the terms harmful, authentic, and choice. So we'll be exploring themes around gender ideologies. So what are they and how can they impact groups in the Western society? We'll be looking into trans and non-binary support, access to support, and ideas and narratives around a risky identity. We'll finally be coming on the intersections between gender and age. So I'm going to introduce something called intersectionality today. Before we can even get into that, I want to start with a few definitions. So again, from a sociological point of view, identity and labels are very, very important to us. So when I'm talking about gender today, I'm referring to gender as a social construct, influenced by cultural depictions of how a person should act, express themselves in relation to masculinity and femininity. When we talk about sex, we'll be referring to sex as a biological, physical, corporal differentiation between male and female. So the assignment of a person's biological sex in relation to external genitalia influenced by chromosomes. Trans is a term I'll be using as an umbrella term, and this will be to describe a person whose gender may or may not sit comfortably within the assigned sex. So whilst trans can be seen as an umbrella term, I'll be using it to talk about someone who wishes to transition from one gender identity to the next. Non-binary, an umbrella term for those whose gender identity does not sit within the dichotomous relationships. So someone who may not sit comfortably between man and woman. Age, and again, this seems a little bit different and a bit daft to explain, but age, I'm talking about chronological age. And again, I'm talking about young people. So when I'm referring to young people, I'm talking about someone between the ages of 11 to 25. So before I start going into what's been going on within the United Kingdom, we need to first think about how do we understand our body? So the body from Western cultures, it was once understood as a natural aspect of humanity. It was as corporal product. We looked at the body as something to heal, to cure, to treat. We looked at our health as like a metric to understand how people were living in society. Gender fell in this metric, and we used to see gender as something that was a biological attribute of someone. It was an inner essence. Your genitalia would depict what kind of person you would be in relation to masculinity and femininity. The body is no longer seen as this natural given, and we know that gender is defined now as a multitude of different factors and ways. So we can talk about gender now as a lens, as a spectrum, as something that's fluid, and it depends on different people of how they see their gender identity, how they negotiate their gender identity, and also what their gender identity essentially means to them. Historically, there are authoritative versions of identity, which we're going to be unpacking quite shortly. But essentially, these authoritative versions tell us how to understand our identities, what our identities mean within society. So within Western cultures, you may hear some quite heteronormative understandings of this. So a little girl should be seen and not heard. Young boys don't cry and things like that. And we know, I'm hoping from the group that we have today, we know that these are just connotations of how we understand identity in certain ways, and it's not the given. But we know that these ideas, these ideologies, and this discourse around gender still exists to some extent. Now, I'm going to be talking quite a bit around age today. And before we do that, we need to kind of unpack what we mean by age. So age, again, I can't change my age if my age is what it is. Okay, so I'm a 28-year-old woman. As a 28-year-old woman, I'm seen as an adult. I have choice over what happens to my body. Age impacts how we navigate society. So for example, a child and an adult will understand and negotiate society very, very differently. Our right to choose and not to choose and change in terms of that too. So within the United Kingdom, a child is anyone who is under the age of 18. A child's rights must be protected and respected both online and offline in spaces as well. So again, we can start to see how we understand and how we conceptualize age. So children are governed differently in different societies, and particularly within the United Kingdom, we can see this in terms of medical and criminal responsibility. A young person who is going through treatment, for example, if under 16, there's a question of when you can and can't make some decisions. We look at someone in terms of their maturity, their age. Can they make a decision of a sound mind, for example? Something else we're going to be covering today are gender ideologies. Now, throughout today's talk, we'll be delving into this term, gender ideology. And what I mean here is a gender ideology, it tells us how society sees and understands people. It tells us how people are organised, and as well as how we value certain identities and where value sometimes shifts and changes. So ideology, it's a system of ideas, and agenda we've just unpacked just there. Now, over the last few years, and actually over the last 20 to 30 to longer, we can see it's increasingly evident in public discourse how we understand gender. We can see that there has been a lot more exposure and emergence of trans and non-binary identities in society through TV, through news, through media, through different spaces that we inhabit on a day-to-day basis. However, people are still being othered, and what I want to look at today are these ideologies and how this is occurring within a Western context. So again, gender ideology tells us how people are organised, how we understand people, what kind of discourses are out there so we can understand different types of people in different spaces. Heteronormativity refers to this endorsement of heterosexuality, the idea of a person's gender that will influence their sexual orientation. For example, a male being sexually attracted to a female and vice versa. Now, throughout this talk, we're going to be relating back to these Western norms and how these Western norms have impacted trans and non-binary bodies. When we talk about gender, and sometimes through teaching, through conversations, through past practice work and things like that, sometimes we talk about gender as if it's this brand new phenomenon. It just popped out somewhere. We start talking about early 2000s, what's going on? When actually it's been going on for, these conversations have been existing for a lot longer. We can date trans bodies back to the 18th century, for example. The early 19th century, we can start to see medical narratives on trans bodies. Through the 90s overall, we can start to see trans activism. We can start to see more bodies being spoken about. Sometimes for good, sometimes we can see a bit of hatred coming in here. And again, this is something we're going to tease through today. Throughout a pre-structural society, gender binaries were understood again as its inner essence. And throughout this timeline, we can start to see that change, that narrative away from this othering kind of lens, if you would. So really, let's get started. Now, this talk, it examines the current human rights situation in the United Kingdom. And again, we'll be talking about autonomy and agency for trans and non-binary bodies. 2022, it's been a very funny old year, and it's included various narratives across the media and news outlets focusing on the intersection between gender and age. Specifically, the intersections between the ages of 11 to 25 in relation to decisions of your identity regarding medical and political decisions. There's a lot of narratives these days around when someone can authentically decide something about their body. And what I find quite interesting here is where your age comes into this. So gender fluidity, it's fluid. It's up to you how you express your gender identity. It's up to you how you decide for your gender identity. But your age puts a bit of a marker on this, in terms of when are you listened to, when can you make decisions, and so on. So my talk, it is based on a qualitative and secondary analysis of documents from articles, charity statements, social media coverage. And we're exploring this narrative between age, gender, and structural barriers. Trans as a concept is not a new phenomenon. However, it wasn't up until 2021 where we start to see trans and non-binary people being added into things such as the census. So for anyone who doesn't know, the census is a metric that we have on an annual basis that gives an idea of who is in the UK, who sits in certain groups, what do people think, what is going on. It looks into views, it looks into issues, it looks into health inequalities and things like that. Now, visibility allows communities to bloom, but only if visibility is available. And this wasn't available until 2021. But again, just to give a bit of a narrative about who I'm speaking to today, over 250,000 people identified to be trans in the census of 2021. 48,000 identified as either a trans woman or a trans man, and 30,000 identified as non-binary. So again, there's a reclaim of trans narratives, arguably, in the last 30 odd years. In academia, we can see a lens, we can see a new movement almost around trans identities and how to understand trans identities. In medical forums, we can see new ways to understand people in terms of whether someone wants to transition. Politically, we can see more narratives coming up about, are people included in legislation? Are people protected, and so on? To give a bit of a landscape around support available for trans and non-binary people, this is just a bit of a snippet almost. If you are trans and non-binary in the UK, you have the following available to you. We have things such as a deed poll. So a deed poll is a legal document that provides proof of a change of name. You can change any part of your name, add or remove names, hyphens, or change spelling, whichever you desire. There's recognition around the Gender Recognition Act. So the GRA describes acquired gender as the gender in which an applicant is living and seeking legal recognition. So again, in political spaces, we can see bodies and how they are identified and protected. In terms of support, more and more support is available to young people. For example, Mermaids. Mermaids is a forum that's existed since 1995. It's there to provide online support for anyone who may need it. And that could be a young person, a caregiver, an organisation, or so on. So again, we can see support available to people if they do choose to need it. This can be around your mental health, it can be around advocacy, it can be around just questions and information around what can I do with my body right now. There's more awareness these days, there absolutely is. We can see International Transgender Day of Visibility, we can see Pride Month, Ida Harvard, and things like that. In education and workplaces, again, we can see more and more pushes towards being inclusive. And again, the question of what does it mean to be inclusive? So we can see support in universities opening up different societies for people who fit within the LGBTQ+ networks. We can see charter marks available for organisations to work to be more inclusive. Within healthcare, again, we can see more pushes forward. We can see that gender dysphoria is recognised through the NHS. We can see various different forms of treatment or different processes that someone can go through if they choose to medically transition. What I'm aiming to do here is to give you a bit of a narrative of some of the support that exists for trans and non-binary people. To follow on, we have the Equality Act. Now, the Equality Act legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and within wider society. It replaced previous anti-discrimination acts with one single act. So it's one big overarching act that is there to protect people in day-to-day society, within workplaces and so on. Before 2010, there were other variations. Again, several pieces of legislation were trying to fit the bill for certain identity groups. For example, we had the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, the Race Relation Act of 76, Disability Act of 95, gender reassignment as a protected characteristic started to come in 2010. Again, we can start to see how we're moving forward within the United Kingdom. The Equality Act protects you under the following characteristics. So age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and beliefs, sex and sexual orientation. A person has protected characteristics for gender reassignment if the person is proposing to undergo, is undergoing, or has undergone a process of changing their sex. This is also applicable to someone who is non-binary too, depending on the reason. So again, within the United Kingdom, we can absolutely start to see there is progression. We are moving towards trying to be inclusive to some extent. However, this is a quote I love, and I come back to it no matter what I'm teaching, what I'm talking about, any nook and cranny I can get this quote into. You carry your identities with you, or at least the folks think that you do. If you don't proclaim them, someone else will. When we look at something like the Equality Act, we are looking at identity as very singular axes. We're looking at one and then the other. You're looking at either age or disability or gender reassignment or race. Our identities are a tangled web. Identity is dynamic. It's an aspect of the social world. It's living, it's breathing, okay? Our learning is imposed and thus socially determined, but also determined by us as well as society. We have a variety of different things that fit within our identity. So again, I'm sitting here today. I'm a white cisgendered woman. I am heterosexual. I am from the northeast of England, if my accent hadn't already given it away. I have not got a disability. You can go through and see all the different parts where your identity fits in. Now, when we think about trans and non-binary people, again, they will not just fit into one of these bubbles. So what we're going to be looking into today is intersectionality. So the study of social inequalities, it has dramatically developed and changed over the past so many years, with changing theoretical landscapes to come alongside it. Our identities are not a singular axis. We are not just one thing or the other, and so on. So intersectionality, it isn't a grand theory, but more so a lens. Intersectionality allows us to look at identity very, very differently, bringing everything together in one big mess, like you can see on the screen, but we're looking into everything intersected. When we do this in terms of trans and non-binary bodies, we can start to see further inequalities will fall under the weight of just one inequality. So when we use an intersecting tool, what we can start to see again is how things interconnect, they compound, they come together. So it's not just the case that you are you're a trans woman, you're a young trans woman. Today, what I want us to think about is gender and age. And again, within Western societies, I want you to all start to think, I can't speak. What I want you to start to think about is exactly how does your gender and age intersect? So at what age did you start to think about what am I entitled to? What are my rights? What can I and can't I do in certain spaces? I want you to start to think about how do you navigate your identity in medical spaces, in political spaces, in social spaces. In 2022, there have been various narratives. And originally what I was going to do today was give a bit of a thematic analysis of some of the things that started cropping up in 2022. However, what I decided was I didn't want to give the space to any more of the hatred what's popped up on public forums. But essentially in 2022, what we started to see was some very, very harmful language used towards young trans and non-binary people. There were arguments and ideologies around people being harmed if they were using trans support, for example. There were ideologies around that trans and non-binary people were not a part of the LGBTQ+ network. What doesn't quite make sense? Again, think about the acronym. We start to see some really, really hateful things online. And again, online spaces is where a lot of our young people are inhabiting themselves, particularly during COVID-19, particularly during the cost of living crisis, where people may not be able to afford to go outside. We inhabit these online spaces, and what we started to see was more and more hatred coming up. For example, looking at a charity's website, for example, or a charity social media page, hatred started to crop up more and more and more. Now, these narratives were against marginalised people, stating that people's ideas of their lifestyles, for example, were wrong. You are not a real person. This is harmful to other people. There was discomfort around young people using trans and online support services. There was discomfort around educational institutions opening up their curriculums to look into trans and non-binary people and so on. What I want to do today is flip the switch. So today, what we're going to be looking at is actually the intersections between gender and age in relation to trans and non-binary people, and in relation to the support that they are able to access. So the so what of today, being a part of the LGBTQ+ network, we already know that this can be life-threatening across the globe. We know that discrimination and violence can be experienced in a variety of different forms. However, what I'm arguing today is young trans and non-binary people are at further risk. So a national study what occurred in 2022 found that 45% of LGBTQ+ youth seriously considered suicide in the past year. Nearly 1 in 5. And again, that's quite a harrowing statistic. We've just talked through some of the support available there, but we're not actually talking about how supportive this support is or how accessible it is. 14% of people a part of this national survey attempted suicide. A few of them, 1 in 3, found their home to be gender affirming. So again, we're starting to see that intersection between gender and age. A young person who may be identifying as trans non-binary may still live at home. They may still sit within an educational system where they can't choose what they're going to learn. They may inhabit spaces that are quite hateful. The young people who I used to work with would come online to find somewhere where they felt safe, where they could speak to someone who they felt would understand their story or went through a similar day. What started to happen over the last year and a half was more and more hatred started to infiltrate these spaces. Again, 73% of LGBTQ+ youth reported symptoms of anxiety, with 53% reporting experiences of depression. Moving on, 48% of young people discuss mental health concerns, with 45% outlining concerns regarding obtaining parental or caregiver consent. So again, coming back to this intersection between gender and age, if you are under 16, there is a factor if you're not seen to be of sound mind, or there's something around that young person. It could be something neurological, it could be anything. but you're now questioning whether you're being taken seriously. And I find that quite harmful for that young person. On a day-to-day basis, someone should not be going out in the world questioning if someone's going to take their identity seriously. 43% did report that they felt a fear of not being taken seriously, but 26% said specifically around their gender identity. So less about their age, but actually the person that they want to come out as. They didn't feel that people were taking them seriously in whichever space that was. Now, the study didn't specify whether this was at home or at school or with their peers. But again, that's a quarter of this population who didn't feel safe in their own space. 93% of trans and non-binary youth report to be fearful around being denied access to gender reaffirming treatment, with 91% of trans and non-binary youth concerned around access to public bathrooms due to a state of local laws. These statistics are here to make the point that they are, okay? When we talk about young people, what we start to see across media discourse and around public discourse is this idea that young people are being harmed about going into transport or speaking to people or having more opportunities opened up to them. So what I'd like to do today is actually reframe risk. As a passport worker, what I see is risky is denying people the opportunity to access these spaces. So young people who identify within the umbrella face the same risks as their peers, but awfully a lot more deeper in terms of the certain types of abuses that they may face. So again, 1 in 3 young people were reporting suicide attempts, with being a victim of a crime being added onto that too. Online spaces were not being policed enough. And whilst we know that the digital bill is coming up in the next few years, it's not enough at this stage. 40% of trans people altered their gender expression through how they dress to avoid discrimination or harassment. This figure nearly doubled in terms of non-binary people who took part in this study too. So again, when we talk about the support available, what I'm trying to get at here, and I'm not trying to pull all the awful statistics together. For the sake of it, what I'm trying to say here is we need to reframe risk when we think about young people. Young people often do not know their rights. They do not know what they can and can't do in certain spaces. Some people are coming back from homes or from spaces that they inhabit in their day-to-day lives where they do not feel safe. Online spaces are continuing to be that place too. Just watching the time. So in terms of barriers to support, 41% of trans people experience healthcare staff who lacked an understanding of trans needs. So whilst again, we can see advancement happening within the healthcare sector, there's still a significant amount of people who are still dealing with this day-to-day, either ignorance or lack of awareness. Now, in 2022, the UK actually dropped from 10th to 14th place in terms of equality bodies lacking in an effective protection in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation. Through the statistics I'm talking through today, I can definitely start to see why. Again, we can see these statistics dating back from 2018 and getting severely worse during the pandemic, during the cost of living crisis and so on. And we're not necessarily seeing too much happening here either. Later on in October, we started to see that some online support services had to remove their services completely for young people. And this was due to, again, the extensive trolling and abuse that the service was experiencing. Now, it's one thing to troll and throw hatred at one organisation, but there's not necessarily the consideration of what that does to the person who needs that service. And thousands of young people were then completely eradicated from a service that they use on a day-to-day basis. So again, what we're starting to get at here is the increased amount of hatred, of trolling, of lack of awareness around trans and non-binary people start to really impact the young people who were needing these services. It was directly impacting the young people and their families. Their services and their support and their crutch in some cases was completely removed. What we're seeing here is a very, very scary place that we're seeing online. And again, online spaces are sometimes the place where someone can gain that little bit of safety, that little bit of comfort, that little place where they feel like they can be themselves away from whatever else is going on in the day-to-day world. So again, I started to look into more around absence. There was a real narrative around about us, without us. So again, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention Youth Risk Behaviour Survey, quite the mouthful, put together a survey on LGBTQ participants to suffer with mental health. Trans and non-binary people were completely eradicated from the study. People were not even looking into the support that was needed there in terms of mental health. regardless of the support or the lack of support that's just been outlined in the last few slides. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, I promise. That's not the case of today's presentation, by no means. We can start to see some fantastic things going on within the trans advocacy state. We can see that organisations such as Mermaids have put together the Mango Project. We can see young people starting to claim their space, starting to understand human rights and starting to understand how to fight back some of these awful narratives that have been put out. But still, if we dissect the support I was talking about before, we can still see we're in quite an unsafe space. We know that 12,296 people were waiting on the gender identity clinic in the UK. Now, that's on the basis and presumption that someone does want to transition, but just focusing on people who do, that is a mass of people who are still waiting for support. 264 monthly referrals come in, but the first appointments are still backdating since 2018. So before, again, COVID-19 happened, the cost of living crisis and so on. GPs are still experiencing barriers in terms of awareness and prejudice around young and trans people. We can see that research still shows that young people face bullying and victimisation within schools. And while schools can handle this on a case-by-case basis, still more needs to be done. Charity surveys have found that trans young people face homelessness due to an unsupportive and sometimes abusive home. Again, when we think about the places that we go for safety, our homes, our friends, our GP, I don't know, someone online, anything like that, all these spaces are starting to feel very, very unsafe for some people. The point of today's talk is not, again, to show doom and gloom or anything like that, but I think what we need to do when we think about things such as Pride Month, when we start to think about gender equality, when we think about anything around identity and equality, we need to think about someone's age as well, and whether someone understands their rights and what they can and can't access. At the same time, though, we need to start thinking about the advice and the support and the awareness that we have online. So the nuts of this talk is more needs to be done. There's social political attacks happening on a day-to-day basis, and it's harmful. It's harmful to the services, but more so to the people involved. We know that the government does need to do more in regards to exposing gender ideologies, to exposing some of the hateful things that we are seeing online in today's society. It's crucial within all communities, essentially, to broaden understandings of trans and identities on a global scale. And again, within the United Kingdom, we need to see more of this. Now, of course, we've talked through very quickly, we've talked through some of the issues within the UK, we've talked through some of the support in the UK, but I think what we need to end with was what can we do to make more noise about this? Again, there's young people who don't know what support is available to them. There's young people who don't know who we can turn to and where it is going to be a safe space. So thank you so much for your time today. And I know it has been a bit of a harrowing presentation, but I hope some of these statistics are something that you do take away with you today to think about. And again, think about what we can do within these spaces too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting. And we have a couple of questions before you go. First one is, what avenues are there to ensure support for trans people in the face of this increased intolerance?
So it depends on the spaces. Again, there are the likes of Mermaids who they aim to offer 24/7 support. Mind have their own little sector around gender identity, where there are specialists who are aware around gender related issues, around mental health and in relation to things such as gender dysphoria and so on. I'd push people to think about their own organisations though. Does your organisation have something, and if not, why? Again, it's not the worst thing in the world to ask, well, why don't we do this? Have that uncomfortable situation or conversation about what can we do and what are we missing? Most, or hopefully most, will be looking to some of the specialists in the area. So again, look at your big national organisations, look at the places what are within your local area who can support you in this too, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. I have another question. In terms of policy, what are the next steps the government can take to further safety for transgender people?
I think, and again, this can only come from a personal point of view, but I think we need to use an intersectional analysis when we look at the Equality Act. Our identities are not just one bubble or the other bubble or anything like that. We know we're a lot more complex and complicated as human beings, rightfully so. There's a lot more to our identities than one bubble or the other. So I think an intersectional analysis and looking into how two or more identities can compound together and what this means for an individual. I would also argue that there needs to be more awareness. Again, it's so easy to throw away a comment online. And if you have an alias, if you've not logged onto something, you've just thrown in a comment, that's it. I think there needs to be more policing around this and thinking about what is a safe and unsafe space. Outside of that, we need to be making more noise and awareness. If the only place people are seeing trans and non-binary identities, if they're not aware and it's just not something that they're reading about or part of the conversations, if all someone can see is the hatred online, I think we need to be doing something about that. I think it needs to be within our education system. It needs to be in the political conversations that we're having. It needs to be in as many rooms as we possibly can. Again, trans and non-binary people are susceptible to the same inequalities and abuse and violence that we all are, but to a very, very different level in some spaces. And I think we have to take accountability of that in some spaces too.
Thank you. Someone would like to know a little bit more about mermaids and the Mango project that you mentioned.
So Mermaids has existed since 1995, and it came together from a group of parents who had children who were going through either medically transitioning, some were not, and it was just a case of there's no safe space to have a conversation. And even the conversation of, do you know what's going on right now? Oh, I'm not too sure myself. Oh, I'm out my depth. So we came together and they started to talk about what we could do to support people. So Mermaids started off very, very small and then grew into the national charity that it is today. So Mermaids offers 24/7 online support. It is the case of a phone call or a web chat or a text or anything like that. It gives young people that opportunity to speak to someone without the face-to-face. What I found whilst working with Mermaids is this gives a really brilliant safe space for someone to just either to try out a pronoun, to try out a name, to talk about something where they don't want to be identified. The Mango project started up the last couple of years, and it's young people coming together to see what we can do around activism. So again, it came from the narrative of about us, without us. So if we feel that there's nothing about us, with us, a part of it, what can we do about it? So Mermaids have set up this, again, a safe space for young people to come together and decide what they want to do about certain situations.
Thank you. If anyone has any more questions, please in the chat. I do have one. It's just around some of the narratives you mentioned. I even encounter them in kind of everyday life as well as kind of in larger spaces like the media. Do you have any advice about how to persuade people about the hostility and the damage that these narratives do, or why the narratives are flawed themselves?
So could you repeat the question? Sorry, you just got off midway just to make sure I've got it.
That's all right. Do you have any advice about how to persuade people that narratives they encounter might not be, they're in bad faith and can be quite damaging and hostile?
So for me, I think it comes from, again, educating. Now, I'm not saying that everyone will want to be educated. There's going to be resistance, but it always is. But I think we have to take accountability sometimes of, if we're hearing these narratives, to call them out in a safe way. If you don't feel safe to do so, please do not. Or in that case, report it to someone else. But I think sometimes some things can be said, and whilst we can think, oh, well, nothing's meant by it, it still has an impact. And I think we need to take accountability for that. Within workplaces specifically, again, we sign contracts to say that we will work professionally. It would not be professional to do this if it was a case of a racial slur or anything like that. We need to take gender-related issues like this very, very seriously. So I think policing language, I think, again, pushing that education out there, but also opening up these conversations. Today, I've taken up about half an hour, and all I've done is talk about some of the awful things going on right now. And that's not the full picture. It's absolutely not. But what I wanted to do today was give a bit of a lens on what's going on with some young people. What shows how a narrative can change depending on how you go about it. I think the fact that we're not having some bigger, widespread explorations into what's going on, again, from a governmental point of view, I think that does absolutely feed into this too. And again, if we're not taking something seriously from a macro scale, it does slowly start to feed into day-to-day society.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's really, really useful to know. I see no more questions, so I'm going to bring the talk to a guys, thank you for coming to speak with us today. We really appreciate it.